Yes, a very good afternoon and many thanks for staying with us right here on NTV Uganda. My name is Rome Bisuka, and of course I'm coming to you yet with another pertinent conversation, largely focusing on how best we can enhance the protection of rights of vulnerable persons and the role of the duty bearers in that regard. To expand more on this conversation or e-dialogue, I'm now joined by the chairperson of the Uganda Human Rights Commission via Zoom, and that is none other than Mariam Wangadia. She won't be alone. Still on Zoom, she will be joined by Bernard Mujuni. He is the Commissioner Equity and Rights, Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development. Also via Zoom, we shall be talking to Mr. Kamadi Bionabye. He is the Director, Research, Education and Documentation at the Uganda Human Rights Commission. In my midst here, physically, I do have Medi Mulumba, a commissioner from the Uganda Human Rights Commission. He won't be alone. He is also flanked by Kanushu Laura. Honorable Laura Kanushu is a member of parliament representing persons with disabilities. We also do have a member representing older persons, and that is none other than Mr. Orach John. He is within our midst. He is the chairperson of the National Network for Older Persons in that regard. Let's kick off with the chairperson of the Uganda Human Rights Commission, that is Mariam Wangadia. A very good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on this e-dialogue, Mariam.
Thank you, our host.
Indeed.
Thank you, NTV.
Indeed, Mariam. Let's kick off with the basic question. What is a vulnerability? Mariam Wangadia, let's kick off with a basic question within this context. What is a vulnerability?
Vulnerability is any impairment or interference with the normal functioning of the body or mind. That's how I can put it.
Go ahead.
Which renders somebody incapable of performing to the standard of the average person in a similar situation.
Honorable Wangadia, what is the distinguished criteria for vulnerability?
Are we together?
Yes, we are still together. Yes, we can hear you, Honorable Wangadia.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Do I go ahead?
Go ahead.
Okay. So our studio guests, ladies and gentlemen, including the viewers on online platforms, I welcome you to this national dialogue on the rights of vulnerable persons. Thank you for your time and commitment to contribute to the fulfillment of the Uganda Human Rights Commission's constitutional mandate to protect and promote human rights in Uganda. Today is just one more occasion among the innumerable activities that the Commission has implemented in the quest to protect and promote the rights of vulnerable persons. We can proudly say that the Commission has been at the forefront of promoting the rights of vulnerable persons, as it is a requirement of the human rights-based approach, which we are championing. We are holding this national dialogue as the climax of the nationwide fact-finding engagements that the Commission organized in 10 regions to establish the issues impacting the enjoyment of human rights by vulnerable persons. The salient human rights issues affecting rights of vulnerable persons were discussed, as well as the existing mechanisms for ensuring the observance and enhancement of the rights of vulnerable persons. The discussions generated several recommendations for improving the human rights situation of vulnerable people. In the spirit of the human rights-based approach, it was critical for us that the vulnerable person actively participates in these dialogues. They did provide the authoritative perspectives on their situation because they are the most affected. The discussions were attended, among others, by persons with disabilities, the older persons, the youth, the women, and persons living with HIV/AIDS. Since the discussions were attended by both duty bearers and the rights holders, we believe that ultimately the number of vulnerable persons aware of their rights and responsibilities increased, and that they were empowered with information to advocate and defend their rights. Similarly, the duty bearers were reminded of their constitutional obligations on human rights, which they fulfill on behalf of the state. Consequently, our expectation is that the observance of human rights will increase as incidents of violations of the rights of vulnerable persons reduce. The issues that emerged from these discussions generally require systemic, strategic, and in some respects, even ad hoc interventions. The constitutional guarantees on equality and non-discrimination, the duty to pay special attention to vulnerable persons, and the progressive policy, legal, and institutional framework that the government has put in place so far were acknowledged as major steps in the right direction. However, the gap between these provisions and the reality on the ground remains a matter of serious concern. It clearly emerged that the rights of vulnerable people are still violated and abused mainly due to the attitudes towards them and discrimination influenced by cultural traditions and practices that ignore their human dignity, disempowerment, especially through lack of information, and sometimes charity interventions that are not sustainable. Sometimes it's outright impunity, lack of or inadequate enforcement of the existing protection frameworks, corruption, and other vices which have contributed to or perpetuated the violations. We are holding this national dialogue to continue the conversation on how to enhance observation of human rights that does not leave vulnerable people behind. The recommendations from the discussions will form our advisories to the government on how best to improve the status of vulnerable people. As a commission, we pledge to carry forward the recommendations to Parliament and all the other relevant duty bearers as our constitutional mandate requires of us, and to ensure that they get due attention and cause necessary change. Anyone can be vulnerable depending on the threat or risk at hand. It would be foolhardy, therefore, to think this matter only concerns those that are vulnerable right now. It is important that we approach these discussions with empathy and understanding, not only because it is our constitutional duty to protect vulnerable people, but also because we may unknowingly be improving the situation for ourselves or our loved ones at some point in time. Let us do what we can today to the best of our abilities when we still have the chance and means to do so. Rights of vulnerable persons are human rights. The Commission is grateful to the government of Uganda for providing the financial support to support these discussions and much more. I wish you a fruitful dialogue. Thank you for your kind attention. And once again, thank you, NTV.
And indeed, thank you to Honorable Mariam Wangadia for that humble submission or preamble into this conversation that is focusing on how best to enhance the promotion and protection of the rights of those vulnerable persons and the role of the duty bearers in that regard. In our midst, we also do have Medi Mulumba, the Commissioner from the Uganda Human Rights Commission, who would like to talk about or break down the real definition of vulnerability and the distinguishing criteria for vulnerability. Very good afternoon once again, Medi Mulumba. On that note, break down for the viewer who is watching this e-dialogue the definition of vulnerability and the distinguishing criteria for vulnerability in that regard.
Vulnerability is a situation where somebody is susceptible to harm. Like the chairperson was saying, anybody can become vulnerable at any one time. When we're looking at vulnerability here, we are looking at people with disability, we are looking at the elderly, we are looking at youth and children, we are looking at people with living with HIV/AIDS, we are looking at people with albinism, we are looking at women. They are all vulnerable in different categories. Actually, I was talking to a friend, and he said, why do you talk, at one time I was talking to a friend, he said, why do you call young people, youth, vulnerable? Then we said, you know, youth, somebody can come and say, we go.
Yes.
And before you realize it, they've gone and they've done harm. That means they are vulnerable, they can be susceptible, they can be put to risk.
To political manipulation.
Political manipulation.
I see.
Then we look at the issue about women. They are vulnerable in such a way. For example, when you look at marriage, they don't have that control to legalize their marriages. In most cases, they lose out when it comes to divorce. When you look at the elderly, yes, they were strong at one time, but they are vulnerable in such a way that there's a gentleman who could, some of them are failing to get the national IDs because the national ID cannot read their thumbprint. So they become vulnerable. They don't even get the money. Some of them are above 80 years old, but they cannot get the SAGE allowances because they don't have national IDs. So that makes them vulnerable. You look at the people with disabilities. People with disabilities, at times when they cannot go and chase over some of these development funds that come, like Mioga, like they are very slow to move. For him to go, he must get somebody to take him there.
Indeed, Mr. Malumba.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So they become vulnerable. We look at people with the impairment, hearing impairments. They cannot, they even now, in most cases, they're discouraged to go to meetings because they cannot hear. We don't have people who are going to, they don't have translators, so they are vulnerable, and the vulnerability somehow, it impacts.
What about the homeless, Mr. Malumba, the refugees, the asylum seekers? Are all these in the bracket of
all of
vulnerable
them?
people?
Actually, I told you, when you want to look at vulnerable, look at people who are susceptible to harm. The refugees are, certainly. The homeless are. The street children are. That's why you are saying anybody can become vulnerable. Even you, if you are walking at night and you are alone, somewhere where you could become vulnerable if, for example, you went to Moroto and you don't know Ikaramajong, and the people you are with don't understand English.
Indeed.
You become vulnerable. So, but these ones which are recognized, we are looking at, for example, in the Ugandan perspective, we are looking at the people with disability. The impairment, we are looking at the elderly, we are looking at the youth, we are looking at the women, we are looking at the children. Children are vulnerable. We are looking at those categories. People living with albinism. At one time, somebody said that, you know, if you get I think it's a head or what of an albino, you are going to become rich. They start hunting for them. So they become vulnerable. People living with HIV/AIDS, people don't want to employ them. They don't want to live near them. And the elderly, they are abandoned by their relatives. You know, you are looking after them. That's why somebody was saying that it's so unfortunate that a parent who can take care of 10 children finds himself or herself at a time when the 10 children cannot take care of one person. So they become vulnerable. That is vulnerability, and the vulnerability is just a question of being susceptible to harm. That risk, when you have that risk, and that risk is imminent. Now in Uganda we have the laws.
Indeed.
We have the laws, we have the Children's Act, we have representations in Parliament for most of the vulnerability. But one, we need funding. You look at somebody with a disability, he cannot access so many buildings.
Indeed.
Because of the structure construction. They have not constructed those pathways for the vulnerable persons.
Mr. Malumba, what about the liberty status, those detainees in our prisons and those actually persons in mental institutions? Are they also vulnerable?
Prisoners are vulnerable persons.
I see.
And you know, they are not in charge of their being.
Indeed.
Even those in mental, you know, you can imagine you are in the mental hospital. Somebody determines whether you are now okay or not okay. You are vulnerable. They can actually even say that it seems this gentleman is mad. Before you realize it, they're injecting you things that you don't understand. We've seen so many people facing those whatever. Yes, they're vulnerable. The sick, anybody who is susceptible to harm, to risk, who cannot perform at the level of an ordinary other citizen of his caliber, becomes vulnerable. Actually, you could not. It is also possible at times that not all elderly are vulnerable. There are some elderly who are actually too strong. You would find you'd find a 70-year-old vulnerable, at times more vulnerable than a 60-year-old. You know, the 60-year-old more vulnerable than a 70-year-old. Yeah.
What about the people living with HIV and AIDS?
I talked about them, yes. HIV, AIDS,
illness, and so forth.
They are vulnerable.
All right, so all the groups you mentioned are in the vulnerable bracket?
Oh, yes.
All right.
Yeah.
So why does the Commission actually focus on vulnerable persons? That's what we would like to know.
The Commission, the creation of the Commission is a creation. The Commission is about mitigating the powers. How do you balance the powers of those people who cannot fight for themselves? So the Commission comes up to make sure that those people who cannot fight for themselves can get their rights. That's why we must focus about the vulnerable, we must focus about the sick, we must focus about those in prisons, we must focus on the elderly. You know, you look at the elderly, at times people come and grab their land. Just because somebody is old, he has had his land for a lot of time, but because he becomes susceptible, at times he ends up losing even the small things that he had. That's why the Commission comes in to make sure that those people's rights are not violated. Yeah.
That is Mehdi Malumba, Commissioner, Uganda Human Rights Commission. And of course, if you're just joining us, this conversation is largely focusing on how best we can promote the protection and also the protection of the rights of the vulnerable persons and the role of the duty bearers in that regard. That was Mehdi Malumba. Let's also talk to Laura Kanushu, an MP. Honorable Laura is representing PWDs in that regard. Let's break down the simplest question ever. Who is a person with a disability?
Thank you very much, the moderator. A person with a disability is defined in the Persons with Disabilities Act as someone who has substantial limitations. They could be mental, they could be sensory, they could be physical. And in his or her interaction with the attitudes of the people, the barriers, the environmental barriers, this person is not able to fully participate in society on an equal basis with the rest of the people. And the Act goes ahead to categorize who a person with disability is. This has been one of the challenges we're having as legislators on people thinking that there are no definitions on who a person with disability is, but there's a clear definition of who a person with disability is in the law. And it talks about people with physical disabilities. Physical is simple physical. You can see someone and know they have a disability. People with visual impairment, people who can't see or people who have low vision, people who are deaf.
Indeed.
People with mental or psychosocial, children with intellectual disabilities, people living with albinism fall under the category. People who suffer dwarfism, and we prefer to call them the little persons, all those fall under the category of persons with disabilities. Recently we had a challenge when we were trying to pass the NSSF bill, where the other parties were saying, how shall we define the persons with disabilities? And I think that's clearly defined under our laws, and it should not be a problem to know.
We've also had another category of invisible disabilities.
Yes.
What are some of those?
Some of the invisible disabilities could be autism, Down syndrome,
Indeed.
Spina bifida, but also mental and psychosocial. And this simply means that when you look at someone on the onset,
they look fine.
They look fine. You can't tell that they actually have a disability. I actually think even sometimes a person who is deaf has an invisible disability, because you meet them on the street and
keep on talking.
Keep on talking. You do not know that they can't actually talk back. it's also an invisible disability.
And some of those were actually roughed up during the COVID-19
Oh,
pandemic
yes.
as police was enforcing its guidelines.
Yes, most of our people were roughed up by the police during the curfew guidelines because they kept asking them, where are you going? Time is up,
They
curfew.
are not hearing.
They're not hearing what they're saying. And some of them were taken to prison. And you know, some of them were not treated so well during the COVID season.
Of course, that is one of the challenges that dogged the PWDs in the, of course, the last 2 years as we battle with this pandemic. What are some of the human rights concerns or challenges affecting persons with disabilities this time around?
I have been a legal aid service provider for the last 15 years before I came into Parliament. And in my work, I represented people with disabilities in courts of law. And one of the main challenges, and I can say that cases that we have handled since 2005, the majority of them were sexual-based violence cases, and next in line were land and property matters. And usually the sexual and gender-based violence is on women and children, girls and women with disabilities. And this is because of the vulnerability that my colleague was talking about.
Indeed.
If a child with disability, for example, we did a case many years ago for a child who had multiple disabilities, and multiple means that you have more than 1 or 2 or 3. So this child was 13, she was deaf, she was blind, she had physical disabilities, so she had all disabilities, and she was raped by a family member. And this is the commonest form of sexual violence that girls and women with disabilities experience. And this is also because they have no ability to report these cases. They have no ability to hire a lawyer. But also, the court system is not favorable to persons with disabilities.
How so?
Talk about the basic one. I like to call it basic because I think access to the building is a basic right that every person should be able to understand. And I was telling people the other day that in this era, we should not be fighting with people to make their buildings accessible. More so, the places where to go to get justice. So if we see High Court still not accessible, that's a big problem. And we have had this law since 2006, which says every public building must be accessible. So number 1 is access to the buildings. Number 2 is the time that courts in this country take to end cases. I mean, if I have been raped, I am a child with a disability, I'm a woman with disability.
Indeed, Kanusha.
Why should a court take 5 years to close that case?
Justice delayed is justice denied.
If I have lost my land. So those are some of the challenges. If a deaf person has a case in court and before they get an interpreter, it's a tug of war. You have to go back and forth. And you know, the Constitution says that sign language shall be a language. So it's a language like Luganda, like Lusoga, like any other language. And when these people who are not persons with disabilities come to court and they can't speak the language of court, their interpreters are right there. So if you can't speak English and you can speak Lusoga, your Musoga interpreter will be there. But it is so hard for a deaf person who comes to court to get an interpreter as quick as the other. And of course, the other one is about the economic empowerment.
Indeed.
We look at many programs that are for the government programs, but also civil society organizations that bring economic empowerment programs. Most of these programs are not necessarily targeting persons with disabilities, except that now we have the government programs like the special grant, like the Myoga, and all the other programs. But we need to design those programs in a manner that is easily accessible for persons with disabilities.
So in a nutshell, PWDs are not accessing these government programs in its entirety.
No, I can't say all of them, but for example, when we went to monitor Myoga as members of parliament, one of the challenges that the people with disabilities told us is there was a criteria for you to qualify for Myoga. You had to have saved a certain amount of money. But we know that statistics show that people with disabilities are amongst the poorest of the poor. So if you want to give me money and you want me to first save 1.5 million, where am I going to get 1.5 million?
The criteria being followed.
So the criteria is not really helping.
National ID is the simplest one.
The simplest one, national ID, he talked about it. People are asking for thumbprints. People have no hands.
Indeed.
So where do I get a thumbprint if I don't have hands?
That is Honorable Laura Kanushu, an MP representing persons with disabilities in our August House. Let's also bring in Bernard Mujuni. He is a Commissioner, Equity and Rights at the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Socio-Development. Bernard Mujuni, a very good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Please break down some of the existing laws and policies that are in place to promote the rights of vulnerable persons within this country, Uganda. Bernard?
All right, thank you. Thank you so much. I think the whole thing is not necessarily about policies. It's about what has the government done and what are we doing at the moment. So first of all, there are various affirmative action programs that we have put in place. We have a grant, the cash transfers for the older persons, which is nationwide, and now we are pushing it down to increase on the age bracket. We also have the disability grant, which actually goes down to the local governments and they distribute to the people with the disabilities. His Excellency recently, during the International Day of People with Disabilities, doubled this grant to around 18 billion shillings. And this is going directly to the people with disabilities at local government level. I think this is a lot that we are doing. But apart from that, we have the social protection policy, which maps out avenues for intervention, both for civil society, private sector, and also government actors. And to me, this is very, very wonderful. Recently, the Equal Opportunities Commission developed the equity guidelines for parish development model. Now, this is very interesting because then you can effectively target people who are vulnerable at community level through programming. You see, you can only include deliberately and using affirmative action through three avenues. One, laws of this country, so that you guarantee rights of the vulnerable people. Two, policies that provide the broader operating environment for civil society, for private sector to work. And three, programming. And those are programs that people directly touch and feel. These are the avenues. But much more importantly is to say that the levels of vulnerability are shifting. Gender-based violence is excavating vulnerability. COVID has excavated vulnerability. Violence against children, because pupils are not going to school and they are subject to a lot of child labor is going on. Yesterday, we were in Moroto disseminating the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, which is also one of the tools that we have developed to empower people, the vulnerable people, to demand for their rights, including communities that find themselves within the natural resource setup or surrounding natural resource. And you know that Karamoja is one of the communities which has some of these challenges. You have ethnic and other individual minorities who by nature of places of their habitual area are in a place of conflict, interested, which picks up interest from private practitioners, government, maybe minerals, licensing, mines, or even just by mere construction of a government program like a project or a pipeline or a road passing through your road. Do you have the power to negotiate, or you just become a victim of middlemen, largely middlemen, not so much with the middle women, but largely middlemen, the sharks who come and take away everything and pay you peanuts. So these are the areas, the new areas and emerging areas of vulnerability, including new areas of exclusion, including technology. You realize that during COVID, when the grants and everything depended on online procurement and online purchases, people did not have access to technology, and therefore they were vulnerable. They were left out. They couldn't access the markets. They couldn't shop. They couldn't. Kids cannot go to school. Those in hard-to-reach areas cannot access education simply because they don't have technology. They don't have data. They don't have money. They don't even have the smartphones and or gadgets to access education. And these are areas which are emerging that are worrying to this country. But the beauty is that the government, and especially the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development, has come up with robust interventions to that effect.
Mujuni, tell us about the SAGE program. How many other people are on this SAGE program? Is it a viable program? Are all the persons actually happy about this program? Bernard?
Yeah, so far we are talking about 250,000 people. It's around 250,000 people. But you see, SAGE is not only about numbers of the people who are directly getting this money. SAGE is about the multiple effect it causes at household level. The children who got school simply because the grandparents have got assurances that they're going to get something at the end of the month. The fact that they can put their assets at disposal because they are sure of earning. The livelihood pattern that is changing, increased and improved dietary at the household level. And this is very, very key and very, very important. Yes.
Why is the enforcement of laws and policies on vulnerable persons very hard in this country? Mr. Bernard?
Yes, you know very much that every time there is a discrimination, someone actually is benefiting from the same. And between me and you, you know that every time you take away something, including even the issues to do with corruption, corruption is a cancer that has eaten away the bread meant for the vulnerable people. When you divert government resources, you are defranchising the vulnerable people from accessing services, goods, and His Excellency was very clear about this during the launch of the anti-corruption week and actually diversion and mistargeting in terms of programming of resources is one of the worst forms of excavating vulnerability for the vulnerable people. Yes, you know that if you do not have water and someone eats away the borehole, definitely the expectant women will have to travel 20 kilometers to access water. If someone eats up a building, a hospital, expectant women will have to travel so many square meters to access antenatal care. And that is very, very, just like as much as you can eat an inch or a foot of the tarmac road, you know that tomorrow it's going to be potholes and potholes, you know. And this today I saw UNRWA walking out on the road in Royal Galilee, and I wondered why actually they come only on Christmas. But I'm saying that if you have that level of mistargeting, a road can break down, a bridge can break down,
Indeed. People
cannot access, and if they don't access services, it excavates vulnerability. And I'm saying, yes, it's a catch-21. Everyone has a role to play here. We are building a nation. We want it to be on a very, very, very strong fundamentals. And governance and accountability is one of the challenges which we must all address.
All right, that is Bernard
so
Mujuni, the Commissioner, Equity and Rights at the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development, very vocal in that regard. If you're just joining us, we are talking about vulnerable persons, and we are focusing on how best to actually enhance the promotion and protection of the rights of the vulnerable persons in Uganda and what the role of the duty bearers actually is in that regard. Let's also bring in Mr. John Orach, the chairperson for the National Network for Older Persons in Uganda. First of all, very good afternoon once again.
Good afternoon, Romeo.
You had Orach's submission. He said, yes, all the people, you know, are happy about the program. What about yourself? Are all the people happy about the SAGE program?
Yes and no. The yes part is that SAGE is one of the best government programs.
Indeed.
It's like he said, the ripple effect is felt. The economy where the SAGE is, the local economy grows by 30%. The people who have got it take care of the grandchildren. They can afford fees for their grandchildren.
25,000 you're going to share.
25,000.
You can afford to take care of the grandchildren, pay school fees.
25,000 might sound a very small amount of money to you and me.
I see.
With Kampala, we spend it in a few minutes, it's gone. But take somebody who has a problem raising 500 shillings.
I see.
And you give him 25,000.
Indeed.
That is good money. And in the hands of the vulnerable older persons,
Indeed.
it is money that does a lot of good. And like Bernard said, the ripple effect is big. So in that respect,
so it's a viable program.
Very viable. It is working very well. It is very well received by the older persons where it is.
Where are you having the contestations on this program?
Now, our problem is, Bernard said 250,000.
Indeed.
Older persons were about 1.5 million.
I agree.
Now, the rest who are not getting, how do they feel?
How are they surviving? Indeed.
How do they feel, first of all? They feel discriminated against by the very program which is meant for them.
And that's what we are talking about right now.
Right. So in a sense, it might be increasing their vulnerability because they are seeing that they are not getting that money, which they should be getting. Yeah. So that is one of the issues we need to address.
And of course, even the 250,000 who have been receiving the money, it has not been timely.
Well, you know,
Some have spent months without getting the money.
The good thing is that they never lose it. So even if there is arrears of 6 months, when the money comes, they will get it. So eventually they will get their money. They are not going to lose. The money is there. Of course, it is inconvenient when you are expecting it and then you don't get it for the 6 months. And then when they come to pay, they pay 2 months rather than the whole 6 months. It becomes a bit of an inconvenience.
You were also telling me before this conversation that you had contestations over who is being considered vulnerable in this regard to access this SAGE program as far as age is concerned.
Yeah, you
because
see,
we're talking about the age of 60 and those above the age of 80.
When this program started in 2011, the entry age was 65 in the rest of the country, but 60 in Karamoja. So the whole of Karamoja is covered. All the Karamojong who are 60 years and above are entitled and they are getting the SAGE. So they have no problem there. Now in 2015, when phase 1, the pilot phase ended, there was an extension of that program to cover another 40 districts. Yeah, by adding a few districts at a time. And then we, the older person, said, look, even the other ones want this money. So we were pressing for a national rollout so that everybody in the country gets this money. Now, what the government did last year was to roll it out to the whole country. Unfortunately, the money wasn't enough to pay everybody. So they put the entry age at 80. Now, that is a problem to older persons.
Break it down. They are watching.
Yeah, because how many people are 80 years and above in this country? About 365,000. In the whole country, 80 and above. Now, the majority of the people are in the 60 to 79-year bracket. The majority of older persons are
over
in that bracket. Yeah, over 1 million, and they don't qualify. So to them, that age bracket, that entry age of 80 is a disadvantage. It's discriminatory. It does not help them. Yeah. So government, of course, gave a good reason. Said we don't have enough money, but eventually we will lower it as money becomes available. We are hoping that next financial year it will come down to 70, and then perhaps to the desired 60, because that is where, no, you are going to ask me who is an older person, but that is where the age for being an older person starts. 60 years and above. Yeah. But right now, in a country where our life expectancy is 64, to expect somebody to live for the next, from 64 to 80, how many years?
Around 20 years.
Yeah, you're right. How many people are going to get there? So in that respect...
So you're saying because of the life expectancy being at 64 years, it was unreasonable to put this money's target for the people aged 80 and above?
Well, no, it wasn't put there because of life expectancy. It was put there because availability
So you're saying
of funds.
People can, by the time they make it to that age, some of whom might have died?
The majority, I think. If our life expectancy is 64.
Indeed.
Yeah, we don't... We still think with an improved economy, let the country work harder, let the economy improve. Let's bring down this age to 60, where it is intended. It's intended to be 60 years and above.
All right, that is amazing. Brings the target age to 60 so that more people are included in this SAGE program in that regard. That is Mr. John Arach. You've already told us who an older person is. You've already told us how many we have in Uganda and when aging does start at the age of 60. But let's also break down some of the challenges or concerns as far as human rights are concerned for the older persons.
Can I correct you? Aging doesn't start at age 60.
Then let's go back to that question. When does aging start?
Aging starts at conception. Because the moment you are born, the moment you are conceived, you start getting age. You start aging. You become, and then when you are born, you become 1 day, 2 days, 1 month, 1 year, and you keep. So aging starts from that, and it just continues throughout life. Yeah. But to become an older person is the universally accepted definition by the UN and by the Uganda national policy for older persons. It's 60 years. But don't look at physical features because they are deceptive. Look at the age, the years.
I could be having gray hair, but when I'm 35.
Or you could be having, like mine, a hairstyle like this, and you know, people these days are born almost bald at 15 years. They are bald.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So you might mistake that young person for an older person.
Yeah.
Indeed.
And then lifestyles, you know, where some people grow older physically very, very early. Yeah, but age-wise, 60 years and above.
Indeed.
And this is by the United Nations and by our policy.
All right, break down the human rights concerns that actually are affecting persons who are older in this country.
There are very many.
Some
There are
which
very
are?
many. Because I want us to start with the human rights-based approach. Now, every older person is entitled to human rights.
Indeed.
Just like anybody else. Yeah. The youth think they are the only ones with the human rights. The children think they are the only ones with the human rights. Older persons are entitled to all those human rights. If we may list them, there are very many. You can start with the right to health, for instance, right to life, to liberty, to freedom, equality before the law, basic needs, food, water, shelter, clothing, right to quality and affordable health care, right to work and economic development. I think we shall come to that later because that is an important part of one of the rights to which older persons maybe need some. Right to information, education and training, right to respect, dignity and privacy, right to security. I think the Commissioner mentioned security and safety as one of the reasons for being vulnerable. Right to access to cultural, spiritual, recreational facilities and resources, right to freedom from exploitation, right to elder abuse, right from being abused, right to fair treatment and no discrimination based on age, social or economic status, the right to vote and be voted, right to association. So all these rights, older persons are entitled to all of them. Now, are they getting those rights? Are those rights being observed? That is an area we need to dwell in.
And indeed, that is the $64,000 question. Thank you very much for that humble submission. Mr. John Orachi is the chairperson of the National Network of Older Persons right here in Uganda. Let's also connect with, that is Mr. Bionarye. Mr. Bionarye, very good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. He is the Director of Research, Education and Documentation. Very good morning, Mr. Kamadi. All right, it is Bernard Mujuni. He is the Commissioner Equity and Rights. He's also joining us from the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development. Mr. Bernard Mujuni, you would like to talk about the plight of vulnerable workers in the informal sector. Bring us up to speed with those, deliberations.
All right, thank you so much, moderator. I think Uganda has seen one of the best robust economy in the whole of this region. And our GDP is doing very well. But remember, according to the study by EPRC, Economic Policy Research Center, and some of the civil society and the government and ministry, we lose almost 3% of GDP because of structural discrimination. Now, this is intended and unintended discrimination because people who are vulnerable find themselves at the periphery of policy, of receiving any support from government, civil society. They are at the tail end of government, receiving government programs. Now, we also lack voice accountability. For example, people on the islands, on the islands, there is a lot of HIV/AIDS, and there are vulnerable women who have lost. Unfortunately, men die faster. I don't know why, but most men in person live vulnerable widows on islands, and definitely they don't have access to institutional services. But remember, these are workers. The island people are people who are fishermen and women. These are informal workers. Now, Uganda has almost 12.5 million people in the informal sector working under tough conditions. Now, most of these workers do not have contracts. They don't contribute to the social security, so they have social insecurity. They don't have access to savings, even banking. They are bankable, but they don't take their money to the bank simply because they are fearing or they are not so sure of whether the formal sector can take care of them. Fortunately, URA has come up and private sector foundation were trying to formalize the informal. But what are the incentives? The workers who get dismissed without notice, simply because probably COVID has set in. COVID saw unemployment going up by almost 30% in the first month. And we received a lot of complaints, and we've seen a lot of corporate establishments winding up business here, simply because the situation has been very volatile. But the beauty of Uganda is that there is food security. Food security, as emphasized and mobilized by HE, the president, has been one of the shock absorber in terms of vulnerability. The moment you are vulnerable, but you have access to food, you have access to recourse, to a livelihood, then your vulnerability gets mitigated. And two, Uganda has a lot of social capital. Even when you lose your job, you can go to your uncle, you can go to your nephew and try to move around. And, Uganda is very enterprising. Most Ugandans are enterprising and they have saved jobs. They try to mitigate vulnerability by being productive in other avenues. Unlike our sisters and brothers across in Kenya, in Rwanda, vulnerability is real vulnerability. You fear you don't have access to food and therefore your life is threatened. But this country is very blessed, and we are blessed that the leadership is in a position to create conducive situations for people to be productive and access markets. And I think His Excellency has been opening all these markets. Remember his metaphor about the woman in the market. To me, this exemplifies how the government has outreached the informal sector to make sure that there are avenues of survival. But we are worried. We are worried because most of the workers in the informal sector are not insured, for example, which is a safety net. In case of accident, compensation becomes a challenge. I have been lucky that I was in a position to be the assistant commissioner in charge of labor inspectorate. And one time we had this peculiar case of women who had been exposed into in a sawdust mill that because of sawdust and they were not padded, the uterus became cancerous, and they had come to our office to seek equitable justice. And the arbitration was that the other employer, who was very strong and with tough lawyers, was saying that no, these people have their own issues, sexual issues, and you could easily see. But the medical arbitration board took effort to examine, and they found that actually they had been absorbing a lot of dust because they are being exposed, and then it became cancerous. Now, cancer is almost terminal if you discover it late. It's almost a death sentence. But there are so many people who are in this position, in this particular position, including vulnerability, crime, people who do not have jobs. They seek to direct capital, primitive capital accumulation, and that is attacking, grabbing your mirror, jumping over your face, over your fence, knowing that there are dogs, there are guns, there, is going to be shot, taking those, the more near-death risks. And we don't want the society to be like this. Fortunately, there has been a lot of effort, especially in the amendments of some of these laws, like the NSSF Act, which has helped to open up the avenues for informal sector to join the formal sector through savings and increasing social security. Avenues where the mid-term access to benefits has been opened up, and this is a very big plus. This is the only country in this region which has excelled in this area.
All right.
And definitely, as the Minister of Gender, Labour and Social Development, we were tasked to develop the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, which has been completed, and it was launched by the Right Honorable Prime Minister. And this is a document that caters and deals with how business can respect fundamental human rights, including the right at world of work, gender-based violence at world of work, eliminating child labor at world of work. And the most vulnerable element
very
the labor
vocal gentleman, Bernard Mujuni.
Labor. It's not the machine that you can easily adjust. You have to oil it. Machine is machine. Labor is the most exploited element in the production chain. And we say no to exploitative labor practices, including casualization of labor, violence at world of work. sexual
All
violence.
right, Bernard
against
Mujini,
women.
thank you very much
carpet
for the
interviews,
humble
about carpet
submission,
interviews.
indeed.
This has been very rampant, especially when someone is vulnerable, they don't have the capacity
Bernard
to negotiate
Mujini,
even
thank you
terms
very
of
much for your
engagement.
humble submission
being
right here on
retained
NTV Uganda. And indeed,
at
that
work.
is Bernard
So,
Mujini,
thank you so much.
the Commissioner of Equity and Rights at the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Socio-Development. Of course, he's not alone here. I have 6 panelists with whom we are actually orchestrating this, yes, e-dialogue on the rights of vulnerable persons right here in Uganda. We are going to go for a short break and return shortly after these messages. Just keep it here. Well, of course, we are still continuing with this very pertinent e-dialogue on the rights of the vulnerable persons in Uganda and trying to access avenues through which we can enhance the promotion and protection of the rights of the vulnerable persons in Uganda, and also compounding on the role of the duty bearers. In our midst, we do have Mehdi Mulumba, the Commissioner, Uganda Human Rights Commission, Laura Kanushu, an MP representing PWDs. We also do have John Orach, the chairperson for the National Network for Older Persons in Uganda via Zoom. We also do have Honorable Maria Mwangadia, the chairperson of the Uganda Human Rights Commission. We also do have Mr. Bernard Mujini. You did hear his submission before the break. He is the Commissioner of Equity and Rights at the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Socio-Development. And the gentleman we are going to be interacting with right now is Mr. Kamadi Bionabye. He is also the Director of Research, Education and also Documentation at the Uganda Human Rights Commission. A very good afternoon, Mr. Bionabye. Once again, we did interact in the morning. Thank you for joining us again.
Good afternoon to you, the panelists in the studio, and our viewers.
All right, Bionabye, what is that one key human rights violation that persons who are vulnerable actually face?
The single most challenge violation that persons with disabilities face is discrimination.
Vulnerable persons.
You know,
Bernard, Bionabye?
Yes, please.
The one key human rights violation that all vulnerable people face.
Discrimination.
Go ahead.
Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is about we are all born equal in dignity and rights. But that is equally provided for under Article 21 of the Constitution of the Republic of Uganda. However, in our day-to-day human rights work, you realize that most violations that occur to persons with disabilities are related with discrimination. Discrimination on grounds of age, talk about children and the elderly, discrimination on the basis of gender, on the basis of sex. That's why we have women as categorized among the vulnerable persons. Most of the men tend to think women are secondary citizens, and therefore they are denied opportunities. Life, like the right to own property, right to work, even right to food, among others. Then there is discrimination on the basis of tribe. Your tribe could land you into being vulnerable, where the majority of for instance, an ethnic group thinks minority groups are not supposed to enjoy certain rights. And all this, like it has been mentioned before, require a human rights-based approach and the cardinal principle of non-discrimination. People listening to us, it is important to ensure that every duty bearer in his or her respective capacity tries to ensure that vulnerable persons are not discriminated against on the grounds that are provided for under Article 21 of our Constitution. Okay. A result of individual attitudes and behavior. Therefore, it is something that we can overcome if we all change our attitude and behavior.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Bionabie Kamadi, the Director, Research, Education and Documentation. Let me also bring in the Commissioner from the same commission, that is the Uganda Human Rights Commission. Medi Mulumba, let's talk about what should be done to address the issue of discrimination among vulnerable persons.
Thank you very much. I think one of the issues that should be made is bringing human rights-based approach in planning and budgeting.
I see.
Both at the national and local level. When you look at that, when we look at budgeting, and budgeting is taking care of the vulnerable persons, then we know that they're going to access remedies to their vulnerability.
Prioritization.
And we also need to get the action numbers of the vulnerable persons. And put up laws. Actually, we have the laws. We need to enforce the laws. Just like the Honorable Commissioner was saying, there is a law that we should have pathways for vulnerable persons when they are people with disabilities to public offices. But there are so many public offices which have not put in place that requirement. So when they do that, then these people cannot access services from those.
You do have a group of people. Uganda Bureau of Statistics came out a few months ago and they said 8 million Ugandans are vulnerable. Are these people part of this group of vulnerable people we are talking about? Food vulnerable, no access to food, COVID-19 measures, I do not have a job anymore, I'm not working anymore. You do have that category of people who are not working anymore. Are they part of the vulnerable group?
Mr. Kamadi was talking about the vulnerability that even your tribe can make you vulnerable.
How so?
Now you say you're coming from this tribe, and then they say, some people say this is a minority tribe, and they don't like you, so they make you vulnerable.
No jobs for you, no nothing.
No jobs for you. They even say you cannot marry this girl, or this girl cannot marry this man because he's coming from a different tribe. He's coming from a different religion. So vulnerability, when you look at it, for example, that vulnerability during COVID may not be the mainstream vulnerability.
Indeed.
We are looking at the vulnerability. People with disabilities, we are looking at the elderly, we are looking at the youth, we are looking at prisoners. For example, prisoner. Today you're a prisoner, tomorrow you're not a prisoner.
So those 8
so
million
you
people
are vulnerable at this time,
about.
but there are these people whose vulnerability is permanent. The people with disability is permanent. Elderly, actually, like you say, like Horace was saying, you start aging as long as on conception. So when you become aged, you become elderly.
Detainees are being considered vulnerable, but their situation is not permanent. Some of which can actually be released. Detainees.
The detainees. Yeah, that's true. That's what I'm trying to say. That when you look at the vulnerabilities, the numbers change, and there are those traditional ones and those who are not traditional. For example, they were saying, let's make sure that we give food to the border riders because they're not riding, but now they're riding, meaning that they're no longer vulnerable in as much as getting food is concerned. But again, they're also again vulnerable in as much as looking for the job hazards, working at night, things like that. They become vulnerable. But most important, we must look at the planning and budgeting in the midst of everything, and we look at human rights-based approach, like Mojini was saying. We are talking about vulnerability. If somebody steals the hospital, it impacts so much on people, but it impacts more on people on the vulnerable persons. It impacts very much on the women, on people with disabilities, on the youth, on the elderly, on refugees. When you look at the refugees, you don't know when you're going to become a refugee. And the refugees don't have safety nets. When they come, you know, somebody who was rich, who had his house, leaves that house and comes to Uganda, for example, he comes with the mat, he cannot come with the mattress, and he's vulnerable. He cannot take care of his children. There are culture clashes. They cannot do so many things. That is why when we look at them, they're vulnerable and they must be helped. You look at the youth. You know, when they brought them yoga, people got yoga. Like the Honorable was saying, you tell a youth that you must contribute money to get yoga. What some other people are doing, the rich, could give them money. We are giving you money, as long as they put that money there, I'm going to get the money.
Indeed.
So he gets the money. So at the end of the day, this vulnerable person, the youth, has again been ripped off. So that's vulnerability. And you know, we must look at how are we going to help them? How are we going to give them, when we are helping them, how are we not going to make life hard for them?
And indeed, Mr. Malumba, what should be done to address that issue of discrimination against this group of vulnerable people?
Discrimination, amongst other things, we must educate people about civic education. We must also educate the parents. When at times parents would at times discriminate children with disabilities.
I see.
Unless they're taught that, you know, being disabled doesn't mean that you are unable of doing anything.
By choosing to send the non-disabled to school and leaving aside those who are disabled.
Actually, in some other places, they even lock them up.
Wow.
They don't want them to be seen in public.
I've seen some tied on trees.
Exactly. So we must educate people and tell them that, you know, he's a child, he's a gift of God, he can be a useful Ugandan, and he should not be discriminated.
Indeed.
Yeah.
What
so
else?
we must tell people.
Besides sensitization, what else?
Sensitization. We must put up laws. We must enjoin planning and budgeting in human rights-based approach everywhere. So that it is by law that you must do ABCD, and we must try to enforce the laws. Uganda has so many laws, like Mujino was saying. We have so many laws, so many good laws, but are we practicing those laws? Then access to justice. Access to justice. You know, this person is vulnerable. He's telling us there is somebody with multiple vulnerability. How is that person going to court? How can he even afford going to court? So we must look at how are we going to help those people. Maybe legal aid should come in and do help. In the commission, we are looking at those vulnerables, and when they come, we take care of their complaints. They don't pay to have their complaints heard. Actually, even give them transport when they come, and then the time of completing a case. You look at a vulnerable person. You are telling him to go or her to go to court. He's going to court. He cannot go to court for 6 years.
Indeed.
He will lose the plot. And actually, because he's vulnerable, he does not even know whether he's going to be around in 6 years. You look at somebody living with HIV. If he knows that he's living with HIV, at his workplace at times he doesn't have right to work. He doesn't access work because people could conveniently dismiss him or her for some other issue because they are worried about such a person.
Indeed.
So, and the albinos. So we must try to educate people and tell them to live in harmony and to obey the law, to look at the constitution.
Indeed, you talk about the albinos, they're being killed.
Oh yes, they are killed. And
Witchcraft.
Actually, they are killed because of witchcraft. Some people think that when they kill them, they're going to get money. And before you realize it, but they're human beings.
Indeed.
And they shouldn't be discriminated. And they don't want to be with them, but they think they can get money out of killing them. Yeah.
That is Mehdi Mulumba, Commissioner, Uganda Human Rights Commission. Let's also bring in Laura.
Maybe I want to also talk about.
Please do. Go ahead.
We have even the children. In Uganda, we have so many families where parents are working and they leave them to maids.
Indeed.
There's a time when there was a maid, when somebody put a CCTV camera and watched a maid from hell, how the maid was slapping, kicking a kid. You know, a 2-year toddler, somebody is punishing a 2-year toddler, and one was actually eating the food of a toddler. But these people are lucky because they had a CCTV camera.
I see.
How many people do have that? So those people are vulnerable, and we must help them, we must educate them, but then we must also tell people to do good to their employees.
Mr. Malumba, there is a group we seem to be forgetting. The young teenagers, the young girls. In this COVID-19 pandemic, 354,000 in 2020 alone were impregnated. In the first month, let me see, January up to July this very year, 196,000 were impregnated. So in tandem, that could be 600,000 young girls being impregnated, 17,000 of whom were actually married off at a very young age or early age.
Actually,
are they part of the vulnerable bracket we're talking
actually,
about?
when you talk about that, there is a girl, who is 13, and he was impregnated twice in the lockdown.
Indeed.
At 12 and at 13. Then, you know, they are vulnerable. Look, there is one who was impregnated by a man because the man promised to buy her sanitary towels. You buy sanitary towels and then you impregnate a girl. They are vulnerable. They are very vulnerable.
And those are the majority.
And then, after that vulnerability, when he gives birth, he may never go back to school. So we must try to see how to help them. Even the parents are so ashamed of those girls when actually it's not their calling. They
And
did go out of the...
off.
Yes, some of them marry them off, some of them just keep them at home. And you know, children are becoming more vulnerable. We also, right now, we are calling on parents to know that come January, students are going to go back to school.
Yeah.
We don't want them to be violent. We don't want domestic violence. We want them to understand that after 2 years, they are going to start paying school fees. And when they are going to start paying school fees, they should be agreeable to when they tell them that, you know what, I am going back to school, not just beating that kid.
Well, thank you very much, Mehdi Malumba, Commissioner, Uganda Human Rights Commission. And of course, schools are reopening on the 10th of January next year. That is 2022. That's a couple of weeks away from today. But then the opinion on inclusive education is taking center stage. Laura Kanushu is a member of parliament representing persons with disabilities. Let's talk about the issue of inclusive education. What should be done by the central government to ensure inclusive education for all vulnerable persons, especially the PWDs?
Thank you very much. Inclusive education is, first of all, it's an obligation of the Ugandan government because they are party to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which says that government must have inclusive education. When we talk about inclusive education...
Is that SDG 4?
No, we're talking about the person with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Inclusive Education.
There's also the SDGs.
Yes. The government has an obligation to make sure that children or people who are going to school are not excluded on the basis of their disability. And exclusion can be indirect and direct.
Indeed.
In the past, we have had what we call the special schools, and I say special, quote unquote.
That is direct exclusion.
Yes, if you get deaf people and you say school for the deaf, school for the blind, so I don't know how many schools we shall have, because we talked about all these disabilities. We are not talking about the invisible disabilities.
Indeed.
So what we are saying is, can we have an inclusive system? So if we have government schools, what we need is simply to have their facilities within the school.
Indeed.
We are not telling government to build more schools, more special, the so-called special schools. So let's take an example. I went to Shimoni.
I was going to mention Shimoni. Indeed.
Shimoni was an inclusive school when I went to school. And the reason my parents took me to Shimoni was because it was an inclusive school.
Just down here, indeed.
Yes, and there were special schools at that time. And when
we had a unit down there.
I'm not talking, there were schools that were specifically for children with disabilities. And when my parents went there, they said, no, we do not want to take our daughter in this school because she has to grow up in a community where she can interact with the rest of the people.
Indeed.
Because education is not about academics. It's about many things.
Indulging with others.
Indulging with others, having friends, you know.
Connections.
And also the other people knowing that actually there are people who look like Laura in the world. And the reason why we're talking about discrimination attitudes is because persons with disabilities and other vulnerable groups have been excluded. So we are saying that government must have an inclusive system in the education system, because we cannot build special schools, special colleges, special universities. So find the schools and put the facilities that the person with disabilities need. You don't, first of all, it's cheaper. It's cheaper. I mean, in Shimoni, there was a unit for children who had intellectual disabilities. There was access to the classes. So I could go to those classes without any problem. But also the children with intellectual disabilities, at break time, at lunchtime, they would interact with the rest of the children. And I'm sure if you found someone who went to Shimoni, they know they've seen much about disability.
Indeed.
It's not like when you walk on the streets and people are staring at you like you've come from another planet.
And that's why I had to become a champion for this same, because I was largely with these individuals in the school setting, and many of the educations I've talked to, they said special schools actually compound the exclusion that we are talking about.
Yes,
and they
do.
say these special persons are actually more susceptible to learning when they're in an environment where able-bodied people are there and themselves, the whole ecosystem, thriving together.
You know, it's very important to be in an inclusive school when you have a disability, because when people look at you, the first thing they see is your disability. But when you come to class and you're getting 98 and the person who is able-bodied is getting 0,
Indeed.
then they begin to respect you and to bring you close and to say, this is actually a human being who is just like me, and you get friends.
Indeed.
So we're saying government must focus on inclusive education. But also, just to digress, we are not only talking about inclusive education.
Indeed.
We are talking about inclusion across the spectrum.
Access to health.
Access to health, employment.
Access to employment.
As members of parliament, we are very deliberate on telling the government that the law is talking about the private sector giving people with disabilities and the quotas. Good, that's wonderful. But we are saying government must be the first employer of persons with disabilities.
See. Indeed.
How many people with disabilities are employed by the public service, for example?
And of course, the viewer is asking him or herself, why do we have so many unemployed PWDs in this country?
Exactly. This government brought affirmative action. We have many people with disabilities that have gone to school that have qualifications, and they have no jobs. And I know that the lack of employment is a general problem. But you know, for us persons with disabilities, for your parents to sacrifice and take you to school against all odds, and then you go back home, even the neighbors are laughing and saying, now you wasted your money on this one. No one can even give them a job. But we're telling government that what we want to see, can we have a percentage of persons with disabilities employed by the government first? And once the government has set that example, then we can talk about the private sector. Because we cannot be telling the private sector to employ persons with disabilities, and yet we, the government, are not employing persons with disabilities. Indeed. That is inclusion that we're talking about. All the things that we're talking about, access to the buildings, access to information. The problem,
of course, if they're not accessing the information, they wouldn't know where the job opportunities are.
Exactly.
If they're not accessing the buildings, they're not able to take their CVs to these organizations.
Exactly. And because of the historical exclusion, the spirit of ableism,
I see,
is what is stopping the enforcement and the implementation of laws. Engineers go to school, they know that public buildings must be accessible. Indeed. It's in their curriculum. But because people have failed to understand that there are people who can't take stairs, and for me, I think that's very simple. I don't know why it's very difficult for people. The people who build these buildings have been trained that there must be an accessible bathroom in a public building. But they're still, I'm going to give an example of KCCA. And I want to name and shame KCCA.
Unapologetic, go ahead.
Unapologetic. We have a councillor who has a disability at KCCA, represent people with disabilities. And their building is not accessible. And I'm talking about an authority that is supposed to enforce.
That is affecting her ability to execute her mandate.
Exactly. These are the people who have the mandate to make sure that other buildings comply. But they are not complying. So every time she comes with her car, they're telling her, you can't pass here, it's for the boss. Wow. Now, the boss can walk. I don't know who the boss is. They can walk, they can do everything. But she has, and the ableism I'm talking about is, so I was telling her the other day, I said, you know these guys, when they were building, when they're putting up their structure, they did not have an idea that a disabled person can drive a car. So you're a councillor with a disability, you have your car, you're coming, and they're telling you can't park here. The law says there has to be special parking for persons with disabilities. And you're telling a person with disability to park 3 kilometers away and walk when they cannot walk.
Out of frustration, she can even quit.
She can quit. She's not doing her job well because of the inconveniences.
Indeed.
So the ableism, to think that everybody can use the stairs, everybody can use this bathroom, everybody can see, everybody can talk, everybody can hear, and then we start doing. And for me, my appeal to the stakeholders and the duty bearers is that, for example, for persons with disabilities, the law has been here since 2006. And I know that we have made a lot of noise. I think the time has come for us to force some people to do what they're supposed to do.
All right, that is Kanoshu Laura, Honorable, representing PWDs in the August House of Parliament in that regard. Well, she is too vocal. Let's also bring in John Orach. Well, he is the chairperson of the National Network for Older Persons right here in Uganda. The issue of retirement at the age of 60 years, is it human rights friendly?
Well, that is the law. And the people who crafted that law think they should retire at 60.
And in your opinion?
But research has shown that the best CEOs, the most effective, are in the 60 to 70 age bracket. So they are actually, the workforce is losing out on that expertise, on that experience, and on what have you. Now, at 60, you are still able.
So you're saying it is a misconception that as you get older, your cognitive abilities go down?
Well, they say that is to give room to the young people to get jobs. But this only applies to the public service.
Indeed.
And in fact, the youth tend to blame the older persons. You are denying us jobs. But the retirement age is 60, and an older person is 60. He is not there in the public service. So how are we denying them the jobs? We are not.
Indeed.
Now, the other thing is, at 60, we want to work. We want to continue to contribute to the development of this country. But like we were talking about discrimination, this is discrimination against the older persons. This is one of them, the right to work.
Indeed.
You are not allowed to work. But now if you want to go into private sector to be able to, you cannot access credit because the banks and these financial institutions, they tell you, at 60 you're a risky borrower. Suppose you cough off tomorrow, who is going to
Even
pay
health insurance was a problem before because of the chronic illnesses, but now some are getting on board.
Yeah, but you see, that is part of the discrimination we face.
Agreed.
Even insurance, health insurance.
Yeah, it was a nick. It was a nick, yes. But then we have
even
Prudential
here is a member of parliament, but at 65, they cannot get insured.
Sure.
And they make the law.
Yeah.
So we are
But now companies like Prudential, companies like ICEA are on board and they're offering health insurance to the older people.
Yeah. So talking of insurance, by the way, that is where we have a problem. And I don't know where the medical health insurance has ended up. But if the older persons who do not have an income, and yet this is supposed to be contributory, how are they going to access that health insurance?
I hear you.
That is one area.
Because they have to pay premiums.
Yes, but you cannot pay a premium if you don't have an income.
So if the premium is 25,000 and your sage money is 25,000, you're going to just pay the premium and not be left with anything to buy salt or sugar.
That is if you are accepted.
Or even pay school fees.
That is if you are accepted.
Which is a minimal chance.
In the first place.
I see.
The scheme might not even accept you because you're an older person.
Indeed, John.
Yeah, you might more liability than an asset.
Indeed.
So this is one of the problems we face. That leads me, by the way, we may not have time to discuss it.
Yes.
The issue of health, yeah, which is of prime importance to older persons.
Yes, John.
Yeah. We in this country do not have medical doctors to treat the diseases of older persons.
I see.
The ones who are called geriatricians. Yeah. Pediatricians, everybody knows about them.
Indeed.
For children, they're everywhere. Gynecologists, everybody knows for women. Physiotherapists, everybody knows about them.
Indeed.
But for us, the older persons and our diseases, geriatricians, where are they? And yet that is a branch of medicine that is practiced worldwide. So in this country, we are talking of duty bearers. That is one discipline that we need to introduce.
Access to health service.
Yes, access to quality health.
Indeed.
Yeah, because older persons and the diseases are unique to them. Now, unless you know it, most of the doctors are gambling with our health because they are not trained to handle that. So these new disciplines of geriatrics and social gerontology, which deals with the aging and the aging process, they already exist. Why aren't they entrenched into our systems here?
Indeed.
Why aren't there courses to produce in geriatric medicine, for instance? So when we are talking about roles of duty bearers, those are some of the things we have to look at. The National Council for Higher Education, why don't they introduce those courses in our universities?
Indeed.
So that to improve the general health. Mind you, the population of older persons is the most rapid increasing population. The numbers are going to double by 2050. Now we have 1.5, 1.7. 2050 we'll have nearly 3 million. What are you going to do with that number?
Indeed.
Yeah. Unless we do something now.
That is John Orach, the chairperson for the National Network of Older Persons in Uganda. Let's talk about the gaps within the legal framework, Mr. Orach. Are there any gaps in the legal framework? The Constitution, we should probe whether or not these laws are going a long way to help older people. You do have a Constitution that is not offering any provision for children who neglect their older persons. You take this child through all the years, primary, secondary, university, and then guess what? How do they repay you back? Neglect you, and the Constitution is not even protecting you. Let's talk about the legal framework.
That has been one of my topics. Chapter 34 of the Constitution mandates a parent to take care of the children. And the children have the Children's Act, which they can use to sue their parents who neglect them. So children are very well covered. Now I take care of my children, I take them to university, they get good jobs, good houses. For some reason, I am now destitute in the village, and the children don't want to know. And I have no law. The Constitution itself has no provision for me, for those children to take care of me. And yet they are my children.
Indeed.
I sold my land, I did what for them? Yeah?
Indeed.
The children, you know what they say? I did not tell you to give birth to me.
And indeed.
You went ahead and did your thing. And that's your problem. Yeah. And yet, I have taken care of them. Why isn't there a law? That is the discrimination we are talking about.
There is no law, sir.
Yeah? But and then the other thing is, we are talking of the protection and promotion of the rights of older persons.
Yes, indeed.
Our law has been in the making for some time, the Older Persons Act. We hope when this bill comes to Parliament, Honourable, you will support the passing of that bill so that it becomes law and it gives older persons some leeway.
Sure.
Because right now, apart from the section, there's a small section in the Constitution mentioning older persons that they have rights like anybody else, Section 30. But Section 78, which allowed the PWDs, the women and what have you, to be in Parliament since 1995, excluded older persons until this year when it was amended. And that is how we got our 5 members of Parliament. Even then, there was so much opposition, even from members of Parliament. What are these older persons coming to do in Parliament? When actually, by law, by African Union Convention, we must be represented by the people who we elect ourselves, who are responsible to us, accountable to us. But the law is not even there to give us that leeway. So we hope that the Older Persons Act, when it comes out, will at least now give protection to older persons.
All right.
So that older women, you know, can have inheritance, which they cannot. A lot of them have problems now. They cannot inherit their husband's property. Yeah? So that at least we have access to legal protection. We thank, by the way, the Commission. At least we can report cases of elder abuse and what have you to the Commission. Our concern is where is the compensation? Once the case has been heard.
I'll talk about it.
Yes.
Indeed.
The compensation to people who lose their land, who are brutalized and what have you, that thing must be put in place and a scheme for enforcement. So that older persons, once you are awarded something, you get your award. Right now, it can take 5 years and you are not compensated. So we appeal to the Commission, at least look at that as well.
All right. That is John Orach, the chairperson of the National Network of Older Persons in Uganda. Let's also bring in Mr. Byonabi Kamadi. He is the Director of Research, Education and Documentation at the Uganda Human Rights Commission. He's joining us via Zoom. Yes, Mr. Byonabi, you're still with us?
Yes, I am.
Yes, Mr. Bionabi, we would like to know what the Commission, Uganda Human Rights Commission, is doing specifically to actually address these issues we've been highlighting affecting the vulnerable persons in Uganda.
Thank you very much. The Commission 1 receives complaints of human rights violations for persons with, for vulnerable persons, including the elderly, children, people living with HIV/AIDS, people with disabilities. These cases have been investigated, and the persons with disabilities have been given redress. The Commission also does monitoring of the rights of vulnerable persons. Most recently, we were monitoring the rights of older persons. We monitor the rights of refugees, rights of children, people living with HIV/AIDS, and then we ensure that where there are gaps, they are brought to the relevant authorities for appropriate action. We have also been involved in sensitization across the country. In November and early December, we convened dialogues, 15 of them across the country, where we targeted over 1,500 persons, vulnerable persons, and they raised a lot of issues that affect them, like what our Mzee is talking about in the studio, issues of SAGE. Our findings indicate that most of the elderly people would like the age to be brought back from 80 to 60 years. Others propose 65. Then the monthly stipend of 25,000 shillings. The elderly people are saying it is peanuts. It's high time for government to, yes, it is good, but a drop in the ocean. So we have interacted with the vulnerable persons in the last 2 months across the country to get their issues. Some of them are the ones we are talking about here, and the idea is to have a special report going to Parliament in order to ensure that these issues are addressed.
All right, Ms. Bionabi Kamadi, the Director of Research, Education and Documentation, thank you very much for that humble submission. Let's also bring in Honorable Medi Mulumba, the Commissioner, Uganda Human Rights Commission. Mr. Mulumba, what are some of the recommendations, Uganda Human Rights Commission is making with regards to the promotion and protection of the rights of vulnerable persons in Uganda?
Thank you very much.
Indeed.
One of the recommendations I'm making, the government should reduce the age of SAGE from 80 to 60.
Nice.
Because like you're saying,
good news from Mr. Orach.
Yes. When you look at the elderly, we don't need them to think that others are being discriminated. Yes, government is saying we don't have enough money, but we want at least to see a progressive realization to go to the age of 60.
Indeed.
Because when we do that, we are going to help so many young people.
Does the life expectancy argument play a part in there? The fact that our life expectancy is at 64 and you're raising this target group at 80, many of whom might not reach that target?
If you go to Japan or China, where the life expectancy is around 70 or 79. Should we say that a 70-year-old is not old?
Of course, that is 70% of the whole population.
I'm saying, isn't he old? so because he's old, elderly is not going to be a function of life expectancy, but it's going to be a function of age, just like we said. Then we need human rights-based approach in budgeting and planning at both national and regional. Then the people who are constructing, especially in government offices, public offices, they should always be cognizant of the fact that we have people with disability, so that they can make walkways for those people. That's one of the recommendations that we're making. And then these other, when they make these, normally when the government programs should bear in mind people with disability. Because people with disability, the vulnerable persons, cannot run or rush for so many things that come their way. Because, like, for example, you are not going to see so many people with disabilities coming to get in yoga funds. First of all, they don't have money for deposits to get the money, and then they cannot haggle so much with these other people who are not vulnerable. And we also want to have a deliberate effort to disaggregate the data of people with disability, so that it can help aid planning. When that is done, I think most of the things are going to be easy. As a commission, we are going to continue amplifying the problems that vulnerable persons face, because we know them, we visit them.
Mr. Mulumba, there is a call for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and also the Gender Ministry to sign and also ratify the African Protocol on, that is the protocol to the African Charter.
Yes, actually, and we are pushing so many protocols to be signed and ratified. And we know that when we do that, it's going to help. But we also know that we have so many good laws, so many excellent laws. We want those laws to be implemented.
What seems to be the problem in implementation, according to your own perspective and investigations?
The problem is at times that people think, people are oblivious of the fact that they can also become vulnerable. You go to a place, there's a parking sign that this is for people with disability, and then you find somebody who thinks that he can take it. He just takes that parking. So at times it is that, and then we need enforcement arm, the strong arm of the law, to say that if you are not doing this, for example, if somebody can construct a building of, say, $10 million, why can't he put up a walkway?
Punitive measures.
That's impunity. So maybe you tell him that, you know what, you cannot use that building for such and such. And then, you know, the vulnerable, we also need to start looking at a culture. Now, this is not about government. We want a culture in Uganda, which is going to come as a result of civic education, where people can respect the elderly, the women, people with disabilities. You know, when you go out of in Europe, an elderly will be allowed not to queue. But here, young people want the elder, want Orach to be fighting with them to get a vaccine. They want people, as a person with disability, to be fighting, to struggle like they're struggling. He cannot struggle for a chair. You know, in some other countries, there are seats which are reserved for vulnerable persons, for those groups, especially the elderly, the people with disability, and the pregnant women, where that when he comes, she gets a seat. But now here, you have to run, you have to tussle it with the young people, and I think that becomes vulnerable. Even the young people themselves, they are vulnerable. In Uganda, we have a population, we have a strong army of youth. That strong army must be harnessed.
Some of them are now being impregnated. What are some of the recommendations coming in from UHRC to actually handle this issue of skyrocketing teenage pregnancies and the many school dropouts? You know,
a teenage pregnancy in most cases is defilement. So we want the defiler to be put to book.
Harsher punishment.
Make it expensive to violate somebody's right.
Thank you.
If you make it expensive, then it's going to be okay. But when somebody impregnates a teenager, a 13-year-old, and then the first thing is the parents are thinking about getting $1 million shillings to buy a boda boda, it's a disservice. You need to punish the parent and punish the defiler. So yes, we need an enforcement of our laws. We have the laws. So
Ms. Kanushu also did talk about improving access to decent employment for PWDs. Is this part of the recommendations coming in from Uganda Human Rights Commission?
Oh yes. You know, we must not discriminate people because of their physical appearance. Actually, somebody can be a person with disability when actually he's extremely too smart, and he can do a job just like another person who is not disabled. So I would really think that yes, that one we recommend it. Decent jobs, even for the elderly. Like he's telling you that somebody is an elderly. Now the elderly are in parliament. We want them to come up with a progressive law. Mr. Rach, there's a parent in Nairobi who is suing his son for not taking care of him.
neglect, yeah.
Yes, and I took care of you, now you must take care of me.
Salary.
Exactly, a quarter of the salary. So,
What about promotion of inclusive
But even in
education?
Tanzania, there is an MP who raised it in their parliament that we must have laws to force
you
children.
know,
And we should.
you know, when you call them special schools, first of all, they are too expensive for the people with disability. Two, it makes them discriminated.
Yeah.
Let those who are those who are not people with disabilities know that people with disability exist.
Indeed.
And let also these ones know that the people without disabilities exist. And let them also know that somebody with disability can outcompete somebody with disability, without disability. So yes, we need inclusive schools. We need schools to have facilities for those people. By the way, like in the commission, when we were making our annual report, we even made the one for brailles, where the people with visual impairment can read the recommendation of the commission, can read the annual report. It is expensive, but we think it is worth doing because those people should also know what is happening. What is the point of teaching them even reading using brailles, and then you cannot give them brailles to read?
Indeed.
It becomes self-defeating.
Indeed.
And you know, at the end of the day, let us also make sure that, you know, they are human beings.
Indeed.
The vulnerable persons are human beings. Refugees are human beings.
Indeed.
Prisoners are human beings. And you know, some of these vulnerabilities are vulnerabilities that we are going to.
There is also this problem of access to information, Medi Mulumba.
But you know, access to information is the right which is put up by the Act in Parliament,
Indeed.
which provides for active information.
A person with a disability might not be able to know that maybe NTV Uganda is hiring. They are not technologically savvy. They cannot work on an iPad. They don't know how to operate it. What is being done in that regard by the Uganda Human Rights Commission? Are we talking about sensitization?
We are sensitizing people, but then
talking to government to remove this 12% tax on data so that
actually
PWDs
that in our annual
can use
report,
the internet?
we recommended that. But you know, then there's another problem in this country. This is a general problem. We have too much fake news. We have social media which has tried to kill the traditional media. We have media which is trying to do breaking news. We have so much fakeness, so much falsehood that at times it's difficult to understand what is happening.
But even the PWDs are not even accessing these falsehoods.
No, even when they face it, because actually they are vulnerable persons. They don't have data. They cannot be on data for a full day. So he goes on data for one day, and by that time they're saying Lumbuye has been arrested. He has been brought to, he came in at 10. Then, you know, by the time they say that Lumbuye is in Turkey, they don't know. So we have so much fake news. And as a country, I think we should desist from that. We should try, I just call on Ugandans to stop faking news.
Mr. Mulumba, what about the issue of economic empowerment of the most vulnerable people with livelihood projects coming in from the government? Will that go a long way in helping the vulnerable?
By the way, let me tell you one thing about vulnerability. It's about resources. Pure and simple. Mr. Wright told you that 25,000 is too much for that person in Moroto, that person in Luka, that person in Gulu. But it may not be too much for Orach, who is in Kampala. Actually, he's not going to struggle to get it. Meaning that vulnerability, even if somebody is a person with disability, what if he's your boss and he's a person with disability? You cannot say that he's vulnerable. So economic empowerment is the thing to go. That is what is going to help. Let us not discriminate them. And by let me tell you one thing.
But even some of these projects are discriminating against these vulnerable persons, like the Youth Livelihood Fund asking people to actually present a national ID. Also the Uganda Women Entrepreneurship Program also requiring people to present a national ID. These are the discriminatory criteria we are talking about that are dampening the resolve of these people to access these projects.
That's why I'm telling you that we need custom-made projects.
Indeed.
Like he told you, you want somebody to put a fingerprint, and that somebody doesn't have a hand. Why is he going to get the fingerprints? So we want some of those things to be customized to be able to help those people. But I also want to tell you that the vulnerable persons, to get where the unvulnerable persons are, they struggle so much. It takes too much effort. It takes more than more than an ordinary person takes to get there. That means we must help them. That means we must customize the projects to suit them.
That is Medi Mulumba, Honorable. He is a Commissioner, Uganda Human Rights Commission. Let's also bring in Honorable Laura Kanushu. She is a Member of Parliament representing PWDs, those are persons with disabilities. As a Member of Parliament representing those people with disabilities, what are you planning to do to ensure the realization of their rights in their entirety in this country?
As members of Parliament, we are doing our job, which is legislation, budgetary allocation, and oversight. I want to say that in this 11th Parliament, the issue is not about coming up with new laws, because like everybody else has said, at least for people with disabilities, unlike my colleague who doesn't have many good laws, but at least for persons with disabilities, I think Uganda is one of the countries that has taken steps in.
So you feel like the legal framework is sufficient?
I think the legal framework is sufficient, and I am not, in my 5-year term, one of the things I'm not thinking about is to say, let's create another law.
What are you focusing on?
We are focusing on socio-economic transformation. We want to make sure that for every single program that the government has put out there, people with disabilities should not miss out. And you know, I think also disability has its advantage, and this is what we are telling the people. So we are saying, for example, we are going into the parish model. Sooner or later, you will not hear about the youth livelihood, you will not hear about the women's fund, because all that is going into the parish model. Now, as members of Parliament, we've been able to convince that we stay with the grant, but we also benefit from the parish model. And the parish model will be giving 10% to the persons with disabilities. That is the percentage that we have advocated for. Now, we need to make sure that that actually happens in our monitoring role. So, in our monitoring role, we want to make sure that people with disabilities are not left out. People with disabilities are not in an island. When we talk about youth, they are there. Women, they are there. Elderly, they are there. So we want to tell people with disabilities also, as members of Parliament, that do not put yourself in a box of disability.
I hear you.
When they say there's a program for the youth and your youth with disability, run for it. If it's for the elderly and you're an elderly with disability, run for it. Do not only wait to hear for the persons with disabilities.
Indeed.
But also the other issue that we want the government to do, and this is the government's role, is to desegregate data.
Indeed.
The speaker has guided us that we can no longer come on the floor and just talk without facts.
You need to be having data.
We need to have even the budgets that we have, even the budget that is talking about the budgetary allocation. I can't say give persons with disabilities this amount of money if I don't have the numbers, if I don't have the data.
It will be hard to budget.
It will be hard to convince the other legislators to allow me to pass the law. It will be hard for a rush to tell the legislators that pass my law if he doesn't have.
And indeed, you might budget for 100 people and find out that there are over 100 million.
Yes.
Indeed.
So and also because data desegregation is a duty of government as well. It's not the duty of civil society. So those are the things we are focusing on, and we want to believe that in the next 5 years. These laws that our predecessors have made.
All right, thank you very much, Laura Kanushu. Let's also bring in Mr. John Oraj. He is the chairperson, National Network for Older Persons right here in Uganda. Now, as the chairperson of the same, what kind of strategies are you coming up with to ensure the promotion and protection of the rights of the older people in the country?
Let me start with where my colleague stops for the...
Indeed, John.
To recognize that there is age-old disability.
Indeed.
A lot of older persons have a disability on account of their age. So that should be recognized in the disability laws.
Indeed.
That is one. And we want also to know that the major problems older persons face are, one, poverty in old age, lack of regular economic. The other one is health. Now, our strategy is to work on the two. Now, we know that these other programs for, like Emyoga, older persons were not included at all, not considered, because they said, they are too old. The Emyoga is for people who are going to use their hands. So we are looking for the parish development model as well. We are looking towards that. But to access that, we need to have our structures of the councils in place. So that is something that we have to work on. That the councils for older persons must be in place from the villages. Some of them are not there, up to the district, so that we can benefit from the parish model. The other thing on the issues of health, we want quality health care for older persons. So that once, at least they can take care of themselves. This is part of the vulnerability. People are vulnerable because they cannot take care of themselves. Yeah. Now, if with the better health, they will take care of themselves. So we are going to work on the health. I've already talked about the geriatrics and social gerontology. We are going to make sure those become catch words, household words, so that everybody knows. We also want to form a technical working group on aging, so that people understand aging. Yeah? And we want the Ugandan society to change their attitude towards older persons. To accept that older persons, everybody is going to get old, including Romeo. In a few years, he's going to be in our group. So you must prepare.
Very insightful conversation indeed. I enjoyed it all the way. John Alright, Kanushu Laura, Ms. Honorable, that is Medi Mulumba. We also did have Mr. Bionabye online Kamadi. Mr. Kamadi would like to give you a few of his parting shots before we close this conversation. Kamadi, what are some of those parting shots to the duty bearers, if you will? Kamadi Bionabye? I think we lost Kamadi Bionabye, but online we did have Kamadi Bionabye, the Director of Research, Education and Documentation. Mr. Kamadi, are you with us?
Hello?
Yes, Mr. Kamadi, your last message to the duty bearers as we go ahead with this conversation on how best to enhance the protection and promotion of the rights of the vulnerable persons.
The duty bearers are encouraged to adopt a human rights-based approach to ensuring that rights of vulnerable persons are addressed. Duty bearers should be accountable. Duty bearers should ensure that elder persons, people with disabilities, and indeed the whole range of vulnerable persons are not discriminated against in any undertaking. They should be consulted to participate in taking decisions that affect them, and duty bearers should most importantly be accountable. All of this requires behavioral and attitudinal change, and it begins in the minds of every duty bearer. That is what I can say.
Can I do it? All right, thank you very much, Mr. Bionabye Kamadi. He is the Director of Research, Education and also Documentation at the Uganda Human Rights Commission. Online too, we did have Bernard Mujuni. He is the Commissioner, Equity and Rights at the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development. And also we did speak to the Chairperson of the Uganda Human Rights Commission, that is none other than Honorable Mariam Wangadia. In my midst here, physically, I did have John Orach, the Chairperson, National Network of Older Persons right here in Uganda. Honorable Laura Kanusha, representing PWDs in Parliament. Honorable Medi Mulumba, Commissioner, Uganda Human Rights Commission. And of course, Mr. John Orach had a message for the older persons in this country. Please go and get vaccinated in that regard. And NMG would like to pass on this message to all Ugandans and the world. Do not discriminate on vulnerable persons. Have a blessed day. Thank you.